historian of the civil wars of Scotland, and that makes me a particularly appropriate person to be chairing a session about John Lilburne, because if there was a bunch of people that John Lilburne disliked even more than the Army Grandees, it was the Scots. In this session, we're going to be contextualising John Lilburne, and I'm very pleased and proud to be able to introduce to you two leading scholars of the Civil War period, and scholars who have really led the field, shaped the field for younger persons such as myself. I'm going to begin by introducing both our speakers. Professor Mike Braddock, as we already know, is Professor of History at Sheffield. He's held numerous fellowships and visiting scholarships in the UK, America, Europe and Australia. I came to his work as a PhD student, interested in state formation, in power relationships, but as we've already heard in the previous session, most of you will know Mike's work, God's Fury, England's Fire, which really describes beautifully for us both the trauma of the period that we're looking at and the opportunities that arose for people like John Lilburne. I'd also like to introduce to you Professor Jason Pesey. Jason is Professor of History at UCL and a leading expert on politics and print culture in early modern Europe. He's the author of two path-breaking studies of the English Revolution, Politics and Pamphleteers, and more recently, Print and Public Politics in the English Revolution. Jason has written about John Lilburne before, and today he's going to be discussing John Lilburne's relationship with the Long Parliament. Sorry, he's written before about John Lilburne's relationship with the Long Parliament. Today he's going to be looking more at Lilburne's international context. But we're going to open this session today with Mike Braddock's paper on John Lilburne, Political Mobilisation and the English Revolution. Thank you, Mike.
I'm sorry to say that apart from a few late arrivals, you've heard this already, but I'm going to do it anyway. The Revolution is usually identified with the abolition of the monarchy, the House of Lords and the National Church, and the establishment of the Commonwealth. This is a significant rupture in the history of a state that continues to have all three. But for the same reason, it invites a view of that period as ultimately a failure, and for people like me at least, and I presume many here, a lost opportunity. What I want to suggest today, though, is another way of looking at the Revolution and its place in our political history. John Lilburne's career offers a way of talking about the revolutionary period differently, as an important moment in the development of political practices in the population at large. Not constitutions then, but partisan political engagement. In doing so, I don't want to celebrate him as the founder of anything, but to present him as an example of a broader process. To do this, I'll talk about Lilburne's whole life as an activist, not just his Ludlow phase. As I've already said, he was on trial for his life 3 times and spent much of his adult life in prison. This reflected a political strategy of confronting religious and political authorities, challenging their fundamental powers, and accepting personal suffering as a way of illustrating injustice and vindicating the authenticity of his ideas. In doing so, he took the well-established performances and self-presentation of the religious martyrdom and turned them to secular ends. Religious conflicts in Europe of the previous 100 years had created many martyrs, of course, and there was considerable consistency in how they behaved and how they were perceived. And this was itself based, of course, on long Christian precedent. Lilburne, though, was unusual, in fact I want to say unique, in using these tactics, this repertoire of self-presentations, to mobilise support for secular political causes, in this case the rights of the freeborn Englishman. Certainly, it's a much more familiar tactic in the 3 centuries after Lilburne than it was before, and to some extent he provided an explicit model for later campaigners. For example, and I owe this point to Ted Valance, who's not here, anyway, Ted was here earlier, on the eve of his public trial, oh he is here, sorry. On the eve of his public trial, supporters presented John Wilkes, the 18th century radical, who also suffered persecution for his beliefs, with a copy of the pamphlet describing Lilburne's legal trials. Wilkes seems to have drawn directly on the experiences of Lilburne. So what I want to do here is offer a preliminary view of how this worked as a political tactic, how dramatising injustice and evoking an emotional reaction worked to foster political engagement. In 1637, Henry Burton, Dr. John Baxter and William Prynne were sentenced to stand in the pillory and have their ears cropped. Their crime was the publication of offensive religious tracts. Prynne's ears had already been cropped, but the remaining stumps came off nonetheless, and his cheeks were branded. In doing so, he took the well-established performances and self-presentation of the religious martyr and turned them to secular ends. Religious conflicts in Europe of the previous 100 years had created many martyrs, of course, and there was considerable consistency in how they behaved and how they were perceived. And this was itself based, of course, on long Christian precedent. Lilburne, though, was unusual, in fact I want to say unique, in using these tactics, this repertoire of self-presentations, to mobilise support for secular political causes, in this case the rights of the freeborn Englishman. Certainly, it's a much more familiar tactic in the 3 centuries after Lilburne than it was before, and to some extent he provided an explicit model for later campaigners. For example, and I owe this point to Ted Valance, who's not here, anyway, Ted was here earlier. On the eve of his public trial, oh, he is here, sorry. On the eve of his public trial, supporters presented John Wilkes, the 18th century radical, who also suffered persecution of his beliefs, with a copy of the pamphlet describing Lilburne's legal trials. Wilkes seems to have drawn directly on the experiences of Lilburne. So what I want to do here is offer a preliminary view of how this worked as a political tactic, how dramatising injustice and evoking an emotional reaction worked to foster political engagement. In 1637, Henry Burton, Dr. John Baxter and William Prynne were sentenced to stand in the pillory and have their ears cropped. Their crime was the publication of offensive religious tracts. Prynne's ears had already been cropped, but the remaining stumps came off nonetheless, and his cheeks were branded. Burton's left ear was cut so close to his head and so clumsily that he lost a lot of blood. In the course of this ordeal, he looked down at a young apprentice, John Lilburne, sitting in the front row, and said, Son, what's the matter that you look so pale? During and after their brutal public mutilations, these Puritan martyrs enjoyed public support, winning a significant moral victory. When Parliament met in November 1640, one of its very first acts was to release them from their exile, and their triumphant entries into London were a considerable embarrassment to Charles I's government. Lilburne was to turn this potentially highly effective model of Christian suffering to secular ends in the course of his remarkable political career. His first brush with the law came in 1637, a prosecution for importing what were known as scandalous and factious books. There's little doubt that he was religiously motivated in seeking to import these books, but in court he took his stand on legal principle. He refused to take an oath to tell the truth, saying it was against law and nature for him to make a promise that might force him to condemn himself. This was his characteristic response to prosecution, to challenge the powers ranged against him. Outraged, the court sentenced him to be whipped from the Fleet prisons to the New Palace Yard at Westminster, there to be pilloried before being imprisoned until he conformed. He met this punishment head-on, with a personal courage that threatened to completely subvert the government's purposes. In fact, in the pillory, he distributed the very books he'd been prosecuted for importing. In another move that was to become very familiar, he launched combatively into print in a coordinated campaign run from Amsterdam, and effectively beyond the reach of English licensing authorities. His vigorous public campaign and his fortitude made him an important public figure, subject to an engraved portrait which remains instantly recognisable in radical circles 350 years later. His punishment, and in particular his courage in the face of it, had given him a political triumph. Between 1640 and 42, Lilburne was present in the crowds that surged around Parliament demanding redress of the grievances of the 1630s, punishment of the leading councillors, and further religious reformation. In May 1641, in a crowd calling for justice on the Earl of Strafford, a key royal advisor, he said things that were to lead to his first accusation of treason, from which he was ultimately protected by the House of Lords. He scuffled with constables at Strafford's execution and was quick to sign up when civil war broke out, fighting at Edgehill, the first major battle of the war, and at Brentford, an important rearguard action which arguably saved London from the Royalists in the first months of the war. His military career was interrupted by capture at Brentford and a second charge of treason. The Royalists at this point were claiming that all those ranged against them were rebels, denying them political legitimacy, and Lilburne was an appropriate subject for such a show trial and execution. He survived due to the heroism of his wife. Her story's been told by Anne Hughes, and I won't go into it here, but also the threat of retaliation by the parliamentary authorities. He was released in a prisoner exchange, returned to military service, but left the army 2 years later. It's these wrangles, I think, that led to the dramatic ideological escalation, and perhaps the crucial moment in his mutation into a secular martyr for political rights. In a pamphlet called The Copy of a Letter to a Friend, he argued that the supreme power in the land lay in the Commons, representative of the people for whose interests and freedoms it was responsible. He was not on the side of Parliament against the King then, but on the side of the people against tyranny, including tyranny exercised by parliaments. And this position led him into conflict with every regime subsequently. In prison from July 1646 until August 1648, Lilburne became the focus for a public petitioning campaign for the rights of the people, from which emerged the Leveller movement. This period was dominated by the attempt to find a viable and lasting peace settlement following the parliamentary military victory and the surrender of the King. Surrender not capture, I'm afraid. In alliance with army radicals who felt betrayed by their parliamentary masters, and through petitions and pamphlets, the Levellers promoted a settlement based on popular sovereignty. They wanted not only restrictions on the monarchy, but also parliamentary reform intended to make it a genuine representative of the people. These principles are enshrined in an agreement of the people, licensing government, but also restricting its power over citizens. This campaign was continually frustrated by more pragmatic politicians. In 1649, Charles was executed, monarchy in the House of Lords abolished, and the year was declared to be the first year of England's freedom, by God's blessing, restored. Commons had legislated without the Lords or royal assent, declaring themselves to be the representative of the people. But the refusal to pass an agreement with the people fueled radical discontent, announced in print by Lilburne's characteristically ecumenical tract, England's New Chains Discovered. Pamphlets, petitions, and mutinous soldiers threatened the stability of the new regime, and in the course of the conflict, Lilburne denied the legitimacy of the new government and seemed to incite armed resistance. He was charged with treason once more, in October 1649, but a jury acquitted him. They did so on the grounds that they were judges of law as well as fact. A number of them subsequently said that they agreed that he'd broken the law in the way that it had been claimed, that the law was a bad one, and so they were going to acquit him. Having survived, Lilburne seemed to try to concentrate on making a living, but involvement in some local campaigns led to accusations of renewed Leveller agitation. Against this background, he became embroiled in an escalating conflict with Sir Arthur Hazelrig, and once again challenged parliamentary authority, denouncing its committee at Haberdashers' Hall in an outspoken pamphlet. It was deemed libellous, and without indictment or hearing, he was fined and banished, an overreaction which bore testimony to the public nuisance he now represented. Banishment was not the end of it, though. In 1653, Cromwell dismissed the Rump, the body responsible for the Revolution of 1649, hoping for faster progress in secular reform and godly reformation. Lilburne took the opportunity to return. His prosecution, he claimed, had died with the Rump. In the ensuing trial, he was once again protected by a jury which refused to find him guilty of a crime worthy of death, as they said. And the level of public support made it unwise for the authorities to argue. Lilburne, rather than being killed, was imprisoned in the Tower and then on Jersey. He returned in October 1655, now quite ill, and was held at Dover Castle. In his last days, he was said to have renounced his activism. He died while out on parole, visiting his wife and newborn child on the 29th of August 1657. Lilburne was an activist then, more than just a leveller. He joined demonstrations, confronted authority, and signed up for the Parliamentary Army, as well as writing tirelessly. His sufferings were not passive, they were almost invited, and his target varied. Bishops, Presbyterians, the House of Lords, prominent parliamentmen, the Commonwealth's Council of State. What they had in common, he came to see, was the potential for secular tyranny. So how did he acquire the public that made this career possible? It came in part through personal connections formed from religious and political solidarities. Networks founded on ideological or theological affinity. And there's no way, you'll be relieved to tell you, you'll be relieved to hear this, I can't tell you about that. Because it's impossible really to talk about that without getting into a very detailed, minute account of day-to-day life in London in the 1640s. But suffice it to say, here's the summary. Starting with the man to whom he was apprenticed, we can find connections to Puritan settlers in New England, prominent parliamentarians, the man in whose regiment he enlisted when the war broke out, the men alongside whom he was tried for treason by Charles I, men who eventually signed the King's death warrant, and so on. All these connections back to the network of the master to whom he was apprenticed. That apprenticeship was sponsored by his uncle George, a litigious and significant figure in the politics of North East England, to whom John's own fate was closely tied, and another series of connections can be traced out from there. George introduced him to a radical milieu with some very significant political connections again. This connectedness, I think, just to return to my more general point, that this is not just a book about Lilburne, but about 1640s England. This connectedness, I think, is not a reflection of something peculiar to Lilburne, but to the intimacy of early modern political society, the closeness of connections in a population of only 5 million, for whom, as Tony Ridley long ago demonstrated, London was an overwhelmingly important presence, absorbing perhaps half of the population increase of the whole country every year. Even setting aside trade, networks of connections among ministers and gentry and internal migration, there were not many degrees of separation between a village constable and a privy councillor. A village constable would know a magistrate, who would know a Lord Lieutenant, who would know a privy councillor. So Lilburne's career is built on the intimacy of this political society, a small, highly governed, highly participatory political culture. But it was also built on his connections in the print business, in Amsterdam in the 1630s, and then with active English printers in the 1640s and 50s, such as Kiffin, Lama and Overton. His access to this new medium and the way in which individuals in that business worked to support and construct his public image was crucial to how he conducted his campaigns. There's something to be said about that based on empirical work on the business and not simply a reading of Lilburne's public account of himself. But that public account is also important to understanding how Lilburne worked. His career was inextricably linked with how it was represented in print, and was inextricably linked to the process of print itself. From his first prosecution for distributing bound books, through his own career as a tireless pamphleteer, authoring scores of titles. In fact, his whole adult life was intimately connected with this newly accessible medium, and much of the material for his biographers has come from his self-presentation in print. Lilburne's life was deliberately made a public property, his trials and sufferings a vehicle by which to promote political change. The creation of this recognisable public face was closely linked to his growing expertise in engagement with parliamentary committees and his skills in legal courtrooms, as well as the more familiar life on London's streets. Papers were scattered in the street, accusations were made publicly at the Exchange, ballads against Lilburne were sung in the street or outside his prison window. Lilburne was unusually successful in the construction and publication of a public image as a political strategy, and one which has proved durably effective. But the development of print, the existence of a lively street politics, and the networks that supported it all helped to explain how that was done, and all provide a context for innumerable other similar careers during the 1640s. He was far from alone. These tactics from the 1640s continued to be staple forms of political engagement thereafter, because print and permanent parliamentary sitting never went away. However, one very distinctive feature of Lilburne's career was the ideas in support of which he used these tactics. He enacted, as I've said, a form of secular political martyrdom which dramatised individual suffering to mobilise support for abstract secular, not theological concepts. I'll briefly talk about how he made that work. Martyrdom, as I said, was common across early modern Europe, riven as it was by deep religious divisions in the aftermath of the Reformation. And there was a shared and widely recognised repertoire of behaviour, familiar on all sides, in how martyrs should act. The Puritan martyrs of Charles I's reign certainly conformed to this repertoire, and there is a direct connection with John Lilburn's self-presentation in the ensuing 2 decades, as he himself acknowledged. Mark Kishlansky's recently detailed how at every stage the Puritan martyrs were offered opportunities to avoid punishment or to scale down the confrontation. His point was to debunk the historical tradition that they were innocents ruthlessly persecuted by a pitiless regime. But there's another question prompted by these early modern understandings of martyrdom, that it was the cause, not the suffering, that made the martyr. It's not enough simply to suffer, you must suffer for the true cause. That the Puritan martyrs more or less invited prosecution did not, in early modern eyes, entirely rob them of their political legitimacy. For contemporaries who accepted their cause, it was possible to see that provoking the government to reveal itself was godly work, rather than just, for example, attention-seeking behaviour, as Mark Kishlansky would like to present it. Contesting the authenticity of martyrdom then took the form of questioning the cause, not the suffering. And the key to Lilburn's political success was to win this battle, to dramatise his sufferings in such a way as to evoke from a majority of people empathy rather than exasperation, to elicit indignation, sympathy and anger, collective emotions which, as much recent work has shown, can be highly productive of political change. How did he conduct himself so as to elicit these responses? Well, firstly, we have to say straight away, he was clearly capable of potentially self-annihilating bravery and fortitude that offer testament to the authenticity of his belief. But this suffering did not prove he was a true martyr. He also had to disprove the counterclaim that he was simply a pain in the neck. One of the last, perhaps even his last directly political pamphlet, was a lengthy refutation of exactly this charge. Pamphlets had circulated with the anagram of his name, "Oh, I burn in hell," and variations of a proposed epitaph, "Here lies a man, no woman could deny it, which died in peace but never lived in quiet. Here's a man so skilled in law and reason, he could convert the sense of the law to treason. The people pray, if o'er his grave ye walk, for to tread softly. If he wake, he'll talk." For Lilburn, in his 1653 trial, his claims that he was a turbulent spirit, a difficult man, were actually life-threatening. "Those who so earnestly desire my blood, wanting matter in court to compass me, have by their politic agents filled every man's mouth with clamours against me, that I have ever been and continue a man of turbulent spirit, always opposing, striving and flying in the faces of all authorities, restless and never satisfied, whoever is uppermost." Completely outrageous claim. They thought, he claimed, that I must be taken off and that otherwise England must never look to rest long in peace. But this was more than just character assassination. It was a test of whether the suffering was in a just cause. He had to counterbalance, he had to outface this counter-charge that he was simply a difficult man, if his suffering was to mean anything politically. On the whole, I think we can say that Lilburn won that battle, since he was twice acquitted by juries who had exactly this question before him. He did it in part by sidestepping the standard arguments about the justice of his cause. He claimed that his cause was that of all Englishmen, not of his co-religionists. This was not, I think, a nationalist claim in a modern sense. It was an appeal to a shared identity as the basis for an empathetic response, but it was based on the civic rights enjoyed by Englishmen. It was a civic, not an ethnic patriotism. Martyrs, in a sense, create communities, and the community that Lilburn was summoning was that of all the people who shared the same civic rights. In any case, it was certainly an appeal to a civic inheritance rather than a shared faith. What Englishmen shared with him was an interest in the due execution of English law, a recognition of the rights that an Englishman enjoyed by virtue of being born. They were not conceded or earned, but adhered in people born in England by virtue simply of being alive. And it's for this reason that some commentators see in Lilburn's campaigns the germs of the human rights tradition. In a deeply divided country, this was a much more religiously divided country, this was a much more broadly appealing martyrdom than that for any particular professional identity. and particularly for Lilburn's own confessional identity. By stages, Lilburn's cause had become a set of claims about law and rights, things common to Englishmen. It entailed no detailed claim about the nature of the true religion. Quoting Lilburn again, "There being not one particular I have contended for, or for which I have suffered, but the right, freedom, safety, and well-being of every particular man, woman, and child in England hath been so highly concerned therein that their freedom or bondage hath depended thereupon." It's easy to see how he could join a coalition urging a peace based on an agreement of the people, since that aligned very well with his previous campaigns. But it's clear that that was simply one of a number of political mobilisations in which he sharpened this set of concerns and this way of expressing them. In seeking to elicit a sympathetic, collective, emotional response, he had effectively secularised the model of political martyrdom in a way that distinguishes him from many contemporary martyrs. If we concentrate on the constitutional measures of the revolution, I think we miss some of its more important consequences for English political development. Recent work in the field has emphasised the development of a public sphere, for example, a sphere of rational political discourse which provided a critical restraint on the state. I prefer to think about this in terms of the relationship between political mobilisations and formal institutional politics. The activation of networks and legitimating languages to bring pressure to bear on formal politics by those outside those institutions. We might place Lilburn and the period of the English Revolution in a history of political engagement before democracy, or political engagement alongside democratic institutions, rather than in the history of the rise of the public sphere. A history of how those outside government have tried and sometimes succeeded in bringing effective pressure on their governing institutions. This analysis follows Lilburn through a number of coalitions, mobilising public support behind particular campaigns using a recognisable rhetorical and behavioural repertoire. It did not entail much party loyalty. Allegiance, as it's usually analysed in this period, does not really capture Lilburn's career. But by eliciting a collective emotional response, he was able to articulate a fairly consistent campaign for abstract civic rights, doing so through a series of shifting coalitions. Lilburn was probing at a gap between parliamentary rhetoric and parliamentary action, pushing the debate away simply from resistance to the policies of Charles I and in the direction of the defence against tyranny enjoyed through the rights of the people. He was not the only person to do this, of course, and was not the sole founder of the rights tradition or of popular sovereignty in an English context. But in his sufferings, Lilburn happened on a political tactic for activists that was of lasting significance and sometimes considerable effectiveness, and which created a subtle but important modulation in the legitimate appeal of the figure of the martyr. The practices of mobilisation in print, parliamentary committees, courtrooms, taverns and other grassroots organisations, it's these tactics of mobilisation as much as their substance, I think, that were the lasting legacy of the 1640s. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mike, not only for telling us more about the significance of John Lilburn, but also describing for us the vibrancy of politics in this period. Jason Peaty is now going to talk to us about print and principles, John Lilburn, Civil War radicalism and the Low Countries.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you everyone for being here. It seems like a great event already. If we know anything about John Lilburn, it is that, as one of the most important political radicals of the mid-17th century, he was steadfast to his principles and acutely conscious of being an Englishman and of the need to make a radical defence of the rights and liberties of a free-born English man. The advert on the back of our programme describes this revolution as a very English revolution. And yet it seems to me that Lilburn is still apt to be misunderstood. And the aim of my talk is to focus on a brief but I think intriguing episode in Lilburn's life, his brief spell in the Low Countries between his banishment on a charge of treason in January 1652 and his return to face trial and imprisonment in June 1653, in order to correct what I think are some pervasive misapprehensions about his attitudes towards the Republic, and to recalibrate our understanding of his Englishness. My suggestion is that the true significance of this episode has not been rigorously analysed or properly understood. It tends to get a few pages in even the biggest and best books on Lilburn. So I want to do this not just to think about how it has been used. It seems to me that this period in Lilburn's life has been used to develop a highly problematic argument that Lilburn was prepared to collude with royalists in the 1650s. But I also think there's a problem in the sense that an opportunity has been missed to recognise that he, like others, learned from his experiences of and reflections upon the Low Countries. My aim will be to challenge the idea that Lilburn became some kind of royalist, but also suggest that even this most English of political radicals was inspired by the example that had been set by the Dutch Republic, which served in important and overlooked ways as a model for constitutional reform in England. Lilburn's experience in the Low Countries in the early 1650s is generally discussed in terms of his fraught relations with the Rump regime, the English Republic, who accused him of treason and expelled him from England. And in terms of the possibility that he conspired with men like the royalist Duke of Buckingham to kill Cromwell and overthrow the Republic. However, while Lilburn certainly knew and consorted with certain royalists, the evidence, it seems to me, needs to be handled with considerable caution. First, while Lilburn's arrival in the Low Countries was observed with interest by leading royalists, who were of course themselves, many of them in exile, men like the Earl of Clarendon and Sir Edward Nicholas were reluctant to trust him, arguing that his banishment was counterfeit, their term, that Lilburn had been sent to cause mischief, and that he would never be willing to do good. Lilburn's royalist contacts indeed were confined to what historians call the so-called Louvre group, based as some of them were in Paris. A somewhat odd, it must be said, assortment of Catholics and pragmatists who pursued a controversial policy of joining forces with Scottish Presbyterians, and more obviously, Lilburn was linked to the Duke of Buckingham, an extremely unorthodox and unpopular royalist who had fallen out of favour with Charles II and who sought to devise any means he could, all sorts of strange and improbable schemes for uniting royalists and republicans, and indeed France and Rome, in order to overthrow Cromwell. At the same time as doing this, Buckingham was also attempting to make his peace with Cromwell, and he may even, so it is said, have spied for the English government. And later he would consort, Buckingham this is, would consort with other dissidents and radicals in the late 1670s. So Buckingham, in a sense, if this is the man that Lilburn is talking to, then there's something peculiar. We should recognise the peculiarity of Buckingham. It's significant, in other words, that it was Buckingham, of all royalists in exile, that Lilburn held close consultations with in 1652, and that this was the relationship which royalists like Clarendon continued to discuss until Lilburn's return to England in June 1653. Secondly, it is important to recognise that the association between Lilburn and the royalists may have been prompted by, and was certainly exploited by, the Rump regime. And there's a very real sense in which I think we may still be kind of suffering under the kind of propaganda created against Lilburn by the English Republic. We can certainly look, therefore, to the chief intelligencer and propagandist of the English Republic after 1649, Thomas Scott. It seems clear, therefore, that Thomas Scott's spies watched Lilburn closely in exile after 1652, enabling reports to be fed into the official newspaper, Mercurius Politicus. And Lilburn certainly claimed to have exposed more than one of these characters. Chief amongst them was a man called Captain Wendy Oxford, who followed him around Europe, effectively with what we might think of as a fake level or identity created for him by the regime, and who wrote pamphlets against Lilburn in exile. According to Lilburn, indeed, Oxford's mission was a subtle and complex one, involving three not entirely compatible strands. Firstly, to convince royalists that Lilburn was really a royalist ally, as Lilburn said, to gull and cheat the credulous cavaliers. Secondly, Lilburn thought that Wendy was attempting to suggest to royalists that Lilburn was in fact a traitor, to exasperate, as Lilburn said, the body of the mad and ranting cavaliers in these parts to cut my throat. And thirdly, Lilburn thought that Oxford was trying to encourage the Dutch to think that Lilburn's banishment was indeed counterfeit, and that he was actually a spy, quote, so that the people in Holland might beat my brains out as a rogue. So whatever the reality of Captain Wendy Oxford's mission as one of Scott's spies, Scott's aim was certainly to damn Lilburn at home. He may have peddled stories that Lilburn had joined the Dutch Navy, and he certainly published intelligence from his spies and from Lilburn's intercepted correspondence in a pamphlet called Several Informations and Examinations, which appeared on the very day that Lilburn's 1653 trial commenced. It was this propaganda work which cemented the association between Lilburn and the Royalists. And Lilburn insisted himself that this pamphlet was, quote, full of the most abominable falsities that ever proceeded from the wicked heart of the falsest man. So what then was the reality of Lilburn's time in the Low Countries? Here the evidence is, it must be said, sketchy. But the evidence we have, it seems to me, nevertheless makes it possible to develop a rather different picture of Lilburn's activity and aims. So, on the one hand, our evidence about Lilburn's known movements are few. But it is clear that during March and early April 1652, he was living in Amsterdam at the house of Miss Mezar in Sheep's Alley. It was said that he lieth very private, not being seen yet in public. Although the English government suspected that he was, as you would suspect, very busy writing. During this period, Lilburn petitioned the local authorities in the Dutch Republic for official protection. But by mid-April, reports began to circulate that he found, quote, small encouragements to stay here. And by May, he had moved to Vianen, a few miles south of Utrecht, just outside the United Provinces. And he evidently spent his remaining time on the continent there and in Bruges, where he eventually found a house through an English friend, and where he stayed until departing for England via Dunkirk and Calais in late May and early June 1653. This picture, therefore, is skeletal, but it seems to confirm that Lilburn faced financial difficulties as well as threats to his safety. He referred indeed to more than one assassination plot by, quote, the rudest sort of cavaliers in Amsterdam. And it also seems to suggest that it proved difficult to stay in Amsterdam once war broke out between England and the Dutch Republic. More importantly, these difficulties helped to make sense of Lilburn's writing and publishing during his exile, which seems to me to reveal a neglected and complex and highly intriguing a picture that has not been very well understood. In part, of course, Lilburn was engaged in printing to continue his propaganda effort in England. And he was said to have boasted on one occasion that, I'll send my papers over into England, which by my agents shall be spread over the nation. And by my agents, my papers shall be brought into the army there. And as soon as these papers are spread, they'll fly in the faces of their officers, so that with the help of my particular interest, the soldiery shall do all themselves, and I'll do nothing but sit in my chair and use my pen. These words do seem to have been ventriloquized through a Republican propagandist. What is clear is that Lilburn's pamphlets, produced in exile in the Low Countries, continued his fight against Cromwell. He attacked Cromwell for assuming what he said was kingly power, even as early as 1652. And he sought to expose Thomas Scott's use of spies. And Lilburn clearly hoped that copies of his pamphlets would be dispersed and then reprinted in England, even if in reality many were merely seized by the authorities in London. But what also seems clear is that Lilburn printed in Amsterdam, in part so that his pamphlets could be read by other English exiles, so a second audience. An audience who evidently had access to a significant volume of other material about and produced in England. And most obviously it seems to me that what Lilburn is doing at this time is not merely talking to his old friends in England, but he's talking to royalist exiles, addressing them in some way. Not least in order to respond to the accusations made against him and the pamphlets produced by Wendy Oxford, this spy from England. So Lilburn made it clear that Wendy Oxford's pamphlets had put him in an awkward position, in the sense that he could either admit claims about his royalist links, and thus ruin his credit with his friends at home, or he could deny them, and face the wrath of local royalists by justifying the parliamentarian cause. Wendy Oxford, in other words, wanted to put Lilburn in an awkward position, and Lilburn knew it. Lilburn knew that he was caught between a rock and a hard place. And he explained that he had been forced to devise ways, quote, to counterbalance these two destructive evils and mischiefs against me and my life. He thus made clear that he felt compelled to develop a friendly familiarity, as he described it, with the rationalist and principlist of the King's party, while also being at pains to stress that this did not mean that he was in league with the royalists. He protested that he and Buckingham had largely been preoccupied with securing the Duke a pass to return to England, and also, Lilburn pointed out that as a banished man, he was deprived of all duties to the English regime, and thus could not be blamed for what he said or did overseas. So Lilburn's pamphlets, in other words, represented an attempt to address both royalists in exile and radicals at home. And this involved a delicate balancing act, in which he expressed a resolve to, quote, stand up against oppression, to propagate the gospel, to preserve the liberty of the people, and to maintain the laws of the land in its purity without corruption and bribery, while also defending his right as a stateless exile to talk to royalists, not least in order to ensure his personal security. Lilburn later reflected, indeed, that his aim was, quote, to evince my strong and earnest affection to my native country and its liberties and freedoms, and my constant study to endeavour its welfare, even while I was beyond the seas, while I was daily struggling with the plotted designs of my death by the barbarous, wicked, and most vile agents of Master Thomas Scott. At the same time, however, Lilburn was also addressing a third audience, a Dutch audience. And this explains the innovative way in which he used print. We've already heard that Lilburn is successively, repeatedly, an innovator in how to use print. And he continues innovating in ways that historians don't seem to have noticed properly while he's in the Dutch Republic. And what he wanted to do was to translate his pamphlets into Dutch, rather than merely to print them in English to be sent over to England or to be read by an English audience. And so with some of his pamphlets, he is the first person, it seems to me, who starts producing pamphlets with a parallel text. One half of a page in Dutch, the same then reprinted in English on the other half of the page. He even claimed that he sought to translate his text not just into Dutch, but also into French and Latin for publication across Northern Europe. Here too, moreover, Lilburn's publishing strategy was complex but explicable. Consistently, Lilburn made clear that his writings were intended to apologise for myself unto the Netherlanders by laying open the true state of his late banishment, and by reassuring the Dutch about his intentions. This is why one of his most important pamphlets in exile, the so-called apologetical narration, consisted in large part of yet another version. We've heard about this tendency for Lilburn to write his autobiography. It's important how we understand it, it's clearly important how he worked. He produces yet another version of his autobiography for a Dutch audience. This is why he denied allegations that he was a spy for the Commonwealth. for a Dutch audience. And this determination to convince the Dutch of his honourable intentions was doubtless strengthened by the worsening relations between England and the United Provinces. Lilburne's need to distance himself from the English regime and to insist on his radical credentials also underpinned plans, apparently never fulfilled, to translate and print yet other classic leveller texts, Putney Projects, the Manifestation of 1649, and even the final version of the Agreement of the People. Lilburne, in other words, in part at least, wants to take his message to a European audience. Of course, the challenge of addressing and convincing three very different audiences simultaneously, the challenge here was obviously significant, and perhaps ultimately unsuccessful. And his printing and his need to print helps to explain ultimately his departure from Amsterdam. It seems clear, therefore, that as relations with England worsened, the Dutch became particularly nervous about his presence and his printing activity, either in case he was indeed a spy, or because the Dutch didn't want to be seen to protect him. He seemed to be protecting Lilburne's Cromwell's chief enemy. And in the end, therefore, Lilburne admitted himself, the Dutch opted to seize copies of his pamphlets, despite his protestations. So this evidence, it seems to me, suggests we need to be cautious about overplaying Lilburne's royalism in exile, while also recognising that he faced serious, if understandable, difficulties in the Dutch Republic. But while Lilburne's enemies claimed that Lilburne became disillusioned with the Dutch, saying petulantly he was made to, they quoted him, perhaps in an invented way, they quoted him as saying that if they, i.e. the Dutch, would not permit me to print here, I would go where I might have that liberty. That's what Lilburne is portrayed as saying, as having said. It seems actually that Lilburne was much more understanding about the position that he was in and the Dutch were in. So while Lilburne did indeed leave Amsterdam in the face of such difficulties and as war broke out, apparently immediately after he saw the declaration of war between England and the United Provinces. It also seems to me that care needs to be taken in assessing his attitude towards the Dutch Republic. So what emerges, it seems to me, is that even though Lilburne said that, I long to see London, he also showed genuine respect for the Dutch Republic. He referred to it as the common receptacle of wearied, tossed and banished men, being a place of the greatest freedom that I ever read or heard of. Adding that Amsterdam in particular was more famous for freedom and flourishing thereby than all the rest. In March 1653, moreover, Lilburne made clear that, although I am very much an Englishman, yet I am, bona fide, no enemy to Holland and its welfare, but desire with all my heart an honest and just peace between them and England. Indeed, Lilburne's subsequent writings make it perfectly clear, not just that he still had much to teach England, but also that such lessons were informed by his time in Holland. And his comments were sometimes framed explicitly in terms of how England needed to imitate the Dutch in order to emulate their glory and the fortunate situation in which Dutch citizens found themselves. From the Dutch, therefore, Lilburne learned how to ease the people of 3/4 of their present charges in taxes and excise. And he also sought to show how England could, and I quote, provide for all the old and lame people in England that are past their work, and for all orphans and children that have no estate nor parents. That's so in a very short time that shall not be a beggar in England, nor any idle person that hath hands or eyes, by means of all which the whole nation shall really and truly in its militia be 10 times stronger, formidabler and powerfuler than now it is. And such comments about the Dutch and their society make even more sense when placed in the wider context of English radicalism and Lilburne's wider circle of friends and supporters. So one pro-Lilburne statement from 1652 demanded a public bank along Dutch lines. And more obviously, we might look to comments by Lilburne's friend, never closer friend than at this time, the preacher Hugh Peter, whose pamphlet called Good Work for a Good Magistrate set out ideas for social, economic and educational reform, the unifying theme of which was that though Holland seemed to get the start of us, i.e. ahead of us, yet we may so follow as to stand at length upon their shoulders and so see further. Hugh Peter advocated new methods for setting the poor and sick to work, where he said Amsterdam is far advanced. And he suggested following a Dutch model in relation to the execution of justice and the use of cheap loans and banks. He suggested remodelling London, a wholesale rebuilding of London, in order to improve the profit, pleasure and ease of its inhabitants, as well as to improve its economic fortunes. And here too, the model was Dutch. And earlier in the century, moreover, another radical pamphleteer, curiously, coincidentally also called Thomas Scott, it's not the same time, not Thomas Scott, he too likewise advocated reflecting on the United Provinces and considering her ways, in order to, quote, learn to be wise by using the Dutch as tutors. So this Thomas Scott explicitly argued that Dutch customs and orders ought to be translated into our Commonwealth, including their treatment of the poor, their tax system, their justice, their architecture, and indeed, quote, the general willingness of their hearts to advance any public work, either for necessary use or ornament, wherein they are a people beyond comparison, forward and liberal, and wedded indeed to the common good. Moreover, for both Hugh Peter and Thomas Scott, the virtuous emulation, as they said, which was being advocated, also extended into issues of politic government. So Scott, for example, explained that I should rejoice to see, instead of that monstrous head too big for the body, which hath cut itself off by breaking asunder the fundamental laws and liberties of the state, I should much rather see some prevention invented against change and disunion. For Hugh Peter, meanwhile, the example of the Dutch led to ideas for things like the use of the ballot box to prevent political corruption, as well as changes to the practice of parliamentary elections. As he said, in the choice of a parliament man, if 1,000 meet to choose, let these choose 100 out of that number to choose for them, and the rest depart. The 100 then out of themselves choose 20 to choose one for that service, and these upon oath to be faithful, if among these 2 be in competition, then to balloting. So a fundamental rethinking of how we might undertake elections to make them more rational and fair. And Peter argued that if these plain and just rules of God's word were observed, there would be no need of any deceitful, base and Machiavellian courses to keep a commonwealth in peace and obedience, as may be seen in the Low Countries, where no people have more liberty than they, nor pay such great taxations, nor so little state anywhere used to preserve authority, and yet the people of so many nations and religions live in the greatest peace and plenty of the world, merely by good justice, mercy, and religion. Now, this evidence about Thomas Scott and Hugh Peter might be thought to have taken us some distance from John Lilburne, but it seems clear that Lilburne and his fellow levellers were much more beholden to the example of the United Provinces than historians have recognised. Overton's famous remonstrance of many thousand citizens, 1646, explicitly argued that the Dutch provided a model for how to maintain an army without the need for impressment, that the Dutch model worked because it was a republic, and that England should copy the Hollanders, our provident neighbours. And as Overton explained, practical reforms were linked to constitutional models. If we would in many things follow their good example and make this nation a state free from the oppression of kings and the corruption of the court, and show love to the people in the constitution of your government, the affection of the people would satisfy all common and public occasions. Indeed, Overton made explicit reference to the Dutch model for leveller ideas about representation and accountability, by arguing that we, the people, are your principals, and and you our agents. And by suggesting that Parliament's power derived from the people's trust and choice. With this language of the Principal, Overton showed clear awareness of a Dutch political system whereby the authorities in the States General were beholden to provincial states and provincial governments, and whereby even provincial governments relied upon the consent of and instructions from their principals in particular towns, i.e. the ordinary people. As such, it is possible to argue that Leveller ideas were more or less directly modelled on the Dutch constitution, not least in terms of their advocacy of local self-government. So according to one of Thomas Scott's spies, Lilburn boasted that he had, quote, good intercourse with Holland. And it now seems to me to be possible to reflect on what he meant. It no longer seems possible merely to treat Lilburn's brief spell in the Low Countries as an awkward interlude, when he merely sought to continue his English political campaigning and when he dabbled with royalism. This is not to deny that Lilburn's position was complicated by his experience of exile, and having ended up opposing the King's trial and execution, he was not unwilling to talk to fellow enemies of the Republic. Nevertheless, we should not place too much weight on the connections between Lilburn and the Royalists, and should instead recognise that Lilburn's position in exile and the tactics of Thomas Scott's spies made it important for him not just to continue his attacks on Cromwell, but also to protect himself from what he described as ranting cavaliers, and to persuade the Dutch people of his good intentions, particularly as England and the United Provinces slid towards war. It is this situation which helps to explain Lilburn's innovative use of bilingual print, and this outward-looking strategy can be seen to have involved more than merely a pragmatic desire for self-preservation and the need to ingratiate himself with Dutchmen who may have suspected his motives. It was also linked, I think, to Lilburn's respect for Dutch society and Dutch political culture. And if Lilburn's reflections on the Dutch were somewhat brief, they nevertheless fit with a strand of English radical thought and with other Leveller texts, which regarded the United Provinces as an exemplar republic, a theme, it seems to me, generally overlooked by historians. What the Levellers valued about the Dutch was their federal republic, in which power was radically decentralised, and in which sovereignty was genuinely popular. And as such, it is possible to argue that while Lilburn and the Levellers may have been proud Englishmen, loyal to the liberties of freeborn Englishmen, they were also willing to respect, learn from, and emulate their European neighbours. In that, as in so much else, might be thought to be wherein lies their inspirational power.
For enriching our understanding of Lilburn and his very reflective aspect of his life. Now in the two papers there's been a lot of discussion of suffering for the cause, and I'm aware that you may all be suffering right now from hunger. However, I think it would be a good thing to have a few questions nonetheless. I'm looking to John for confirmation you can carry on. Thank you very much. We'll just take questions one by one. I did think there was a microphone, is that right? Great. So there's a roving microphone. If you'd like to raise your hand.
Ways by both of them to me, which is that the kind of initial public reputation of Lilburn doesn't have him down as much of a strategic thinker. But it seems to me that in a revolution which had no precedents, where they couldn't draw very much on previous political theory or previous revolutionary experience, he actually did have that capacity. Some of the points that Jason made about how he was dealing with it and attempting to deal tactically with a very awkward and difficult situation where he has at least two, if not more, pressures on him, is evidence of that. And it reminds me of the point, conversely, when Lilburn and Levellers had greatest power behind them. In 1648, he's released from prison. There's a history going back to the Ware rebellion and its crushing by Cromwell, when an instinctive reaction might have been simply to attack the grandees at that point. And he says, no, that he will, as he says to Cromwell, I will never strike you when you are low, I will only strike you when you are high. And he has a sense of the kind of imminent threat of a personal treaty and a re-enthroning of the king, and makes what is quite a difficult strategic decision to forge a revolutionary bloc with the independents at that point. And both those and the points made by both the speakers suggest to me that there's a strategic and tactical mind which isn't often paid tribute to in the accounts of Gilbert.
Thank you, I totally agree. For very understandable reasons, I think a lot of the work that was done on the Levellers in the past focused on their ideas and sought to distill the essence of their theory and their ideas. And that's, you know, necessary and an understandable thing to do. The danger is what got left out was an awareness of how they acted tactically and the practices that they developed. And it's interesting, these are interesting. I mean, Mike is on record very eloquently talking about how one of the keys to understanding this period is to focus on the creativity. And that creativity is intellectual, but it's also practical. And I think it's great fun to watch the Levellers and to watch Lilburn thinking in under pressure in circumstances about how what practices to develop and how they might work and what tactics to deploy. And it's clear that they make some mistakes, as you would in that kind of situation. But it's a tumultuous situation, and they are thinking about how to behave in a very interesting way. I agree.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, but with which I completely agree. But one of the things I'm interested in is comparing these autobiographical accounts of Lilburn and understanding how savvy he is about which details he plays up and which names he has temporary amnesia about, and how he can't quite, date events as precisely sometimes as others. And one of the problems of getting at it is he wants to present himself as the everyman who's just caught in the toils of a tyranny. Whereas in fact he is, as you say, a very savvy activist, and you can get at that by comparing his public account of himself at different points, and it does reveal, again, that sort of tactical savviness, yeah, definitely.
Do you have any further questions? Yes, the gentleman right at the front, please.
Being a savvy activist, as you said, Professor, I would like to just go on the limb of the most interesting conversation and outline so much that is beyond my general knowledge. I was, when last time I was in London, I went down to Putney, the debates and so forth, and I was thinking as you were talking, with all the pamphleteering going on, was at the same time something that was anathema to the Putney debaters about Lilburn. He was so keen, as you say, on universal rights, and yet the Putney debates did not get anywhere near that sort of idea of universal suffrage and other things that you're mentioning as Lilburn was fighting for. Dedicated to such an extent, unbelievable way of life, let alone all the punishments to go with it. And to me, it's quite remarkable. So I just wondered, was there a certain anathema between the Putney debaters and what was going on there behind Lilburn's thinking? Was he still way in advance of that? Thank you.
He certainly had fractious relations with more or less everyone not just the royalists, but within the parliamentary regime. He said very early on that my duties to my conscience and even my family or children should not stand, just as a principle of human life, you should follow your conscience, not any kind of human constraints. So he had extremely fractious relations with everyone, really, over time. But he also had a capacity for forgiveness. So he fell out with Cromwell. Cromwell had tried to have him killed. But then he was able to write letters to Cromwell signing himself your ever-loving friend. I mean, he felt that the battle was about ideas, not about relationships, I think. And so he found it easy to forgive as well as to fall out with people, I think, relatively. The contents of the ideas are certainly, in advance of what anyone engaged in practical politics thought was possible. So it was really a battle between people who wanted a practical, stable settlement and people who wanted a just settlement, as Lilburn put it. He'd have seen them as pragmatists and sell-out politicians, as opposed to truly principled activists. And I've had bureaucratic power thrust upon me, and I know something about the compromises it brings. And I'm not, like when I was in power, such as it was, I didn't altogether like the Lilburns that I was working with. So I wouldn't claim to be completely a Lilburn guy, but so I think that certainly around the Putney debates, a lot of the tension was about a lot of the radical causes about a just settlement. What kind of settlement can possibly justify the suffering of all already gone? And that led to a very radical settlement. Whereas some people were saying, how can we have a stable settlement that will prevent a descent into this kind of bloodshed again, which is a good political course, but it points to a different set of interests. And I think that was the difference around the Putney debates. People who wanted peace and people who wanted a just peace because of all the suffering that had gone on.
I too agree with my learned friend. Our views of what happened at Putney we've had to question in recent years. There was always, I suppose, a sense that there were two kind of sides and they kind of came to blows at Putney. But I think what we've been forced to think about more recently is whether that was set up in advance, in a sense, knowingly, as a battle between Ireton and the Levellers, as a big kind of set-piece occasion. Then question marks were raised about whether or not actually the key texts that provoked these debates were really Leveller documents, part of a ridiculous attempt to deny the existence of the Levellers and to downplay their importance. But there is some messiness around Putney. But I think it goes back to this idea of the kind of turmoil and excitement at the time. There's a lot of fluidity in the weeks leading up to Putney, and there's a lot of, in a sense, radical voices, but aren't necessarily totally all in agreement or very well organised together. And so there is a part. It seems to me that part of the tension that emerges, a better way perhaps of thinking about the tension that emerges in Putney, which is definitely there. You're absolutely right. There's a lot of hostility, but I think in part it's because Ireton and people like that are somewhat taken by surprise by some of the things that they're hearing. So there's something of shock. They're in something of shock because of the ways in which some of these ideas are emerging in very kind of dramatic, somewhat less than entirely well organised and unexpected ways. And that, it seems to me, to explain the tension and the frustration that's there. So in a sense, it seems to me that we've had to revise how we think about that. It's definitely tense there, but in a sense the tension is about this sense that this radical movement that's emerging in 1647 has all sorts of different groups within it, more or less working with each other, more or less happy with each other. It's a somewhat splintered group, perhaps in the process of coming together. But that means that there's an element of chaos about it. But that seems to me to be where the excitement and indeed the animosity comes from.
I'd like to take one more question before we hit the sandwiches from the gentleman just down here.
Consequent on that, what is the relationship between Wilbur and these people in Putney? Because the impression we've been given is he's a kind of maverick out on his own. But there must have been an element of, he must have had an element of support in England. So how did that, can you spell that out briefly for us?
Sure. I think that there's some mileage in seeing what is happening here in terms of what we think of as a radical movement as something like a coalition, and it is in the process of coming together. So Lilburn has support, but he also wants to win support. It would be a mistake to I think at this stage in 1647 to see Lilburn as the undisputed leader around whom all the other radicals are gathered. He is a player, but he is not running the show. So he is partly trying to create a coalition, forge some sort of more unified perhaps movement. But it's not totally happening. So he has a lot of respect, but he is also trying to win respect and win support. And so the battle in that sense hasn't been achieved yet. That has not been achieved by the time of Putney. And that's that point about fluidity.
Mike doesn't want to respond.
I agree. One of the distinctions we would draw is between civilian radicals and army radicals, and Lilburn is one of those people who's got military credentials as well as civilian radical credentials, and I think that's one of the distinctive positions he holds in those debates. But you shouldn't forget in the Lebanon movement that he was in prison for virtually the whole of the period, so he was very much he wasn't a street activist in the Lebanon moment. He was a writer behind it.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you to all of you for your questions and for your attention in this session. I think we're all agreed that we have been confronted with new ideas, new ways of thinking about Wilbur, new aspects of his life that perhaps we didn't know so much about. So I'd just like to thank Mike and Jason and the rest of you.